Live from the University of Texas at Austin, the Liberal Arts Development Studios present Essentials of AI for Life and Society. And now, here are your professors, Joydeep Biswas, Don Fazell, and Peter Stone.
Hi, I'm Don Fazell, Chair of the Computer Science Department here at UT, and welcome to Week 5 of the Essentials of AI for Life and Society. This week we're talking about machine learning paradigms with Professor Ray Mooney, my friend and colleague for many years in the Computer Science Department, and an internationally renowned researcher in natural language processing. Ray, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Don. So I'm going to talk today about machine learning paradigms, and you had a sort of intro to ML as machine learning goes by Adam Clivens. I did watch his talk, and hopefully mine will fit in and complement what he had to say last week. Okay, so as Adam talked about last week, a lot of machine learning works in this framework of supervised categorization, where you're given some item like an image or a document or a database entry to describe some entity, and you want to determine what the correct category that it's in from a fixed set of options. And he used the example of spam filtering. I actually independently came up with a similar example that I'll talk about, the same example I'll talk about later. And you learn to do this classification by training on usually a very large set of labeled examples that have been pre-categorized that you can learn to do this task of slotting some example into a category. But Adam didn't have time to get into some of the details about what I call the two fundamental issues of building a machine learning system. One is, how does a computer represent the concept or this categorization function or hypothesis? I mean, Adam used various words to refer to it that you want to learn. And then, how does the computer find that right hypothesis that fits the training data effectively and does that efficiently? And so we're going to talk about several different approaches that people have used in the history of machine learning to do this. And I put these 5 approaches up as a sort of alternate names. I gave 2 names to each of them. The symbolic rule-based approach, the Bayesian probabilistic approach, the connectionist neural net approach, the evolutionary genetic algorithms approach, and then the analogical or instance-based approach. And this pretty much covers the range of techniques that people have developed in machine learning over the past 50 years, or more than that. I get this 5-way categorization from this popular book on machine learning that Pedro Domingos published a number of years ago. He calls it the 5 tribes analysis. He calls his book the master algorithm, How the Quest for the Ultimate Learning Machine Will Remake Our World. I actually consulted with Pedro when he was writing this book. He acknowledged me at the end, providing him feedback. Well, one of the initial feedbacks I told him is, Pedro, I don't like the title of your book. Being a Tolkien and Lord of the Rings expert, I said, it sounds like one algorithm to rule them all and in the darkness bind them. I said, this is a really bad cover story to put. So I actually recommend the book, but skip the beginning and the end and focus in the middle where he talks about these 5 different approaches. I really don't like the cover story that Pedro puts on the whole thing. But I do recommend it as an interesting, and it's written for the general populace. It's not a very technical book. But, so, to first, and I'm going to have to do a quick, really quick survey of these 5 different approaches. So the one, as I first talked, is the symbolic or rule-based approach, where we represent concepts in some sort of symbolic form, typically like logical rules or decision trees. So instead of logical, I use this example of, diagnosing someone as having COVID, and there's not really any medical knowledge here. I'm just trying to use this as an illustrative example. So say you have a couple of rules. It says, if you have a fever and you've lost your smell, then you have COVID, or if you have fever and you've lost your taste, you have COVID. And you can also represent as what's called a decision tree, where you have, you look at one feature like fever, you decide, okay, if you don't have a fever, then you don't have COVID. If you do, then if you lost your smell, then yes, you do. If not, then maybe if you've lost your taste, then you have it. So there are 2 standard ways of representing concepts in a symbolic or rule-based form. I'm going to talk just really briefly about how people have typically learned things like decision trees. And you recursively build this top-down by picking a feature at each step that best separates the data. So say initially we have a set of examples where they've been labeled as COVID or not COVID patients, and we have symptom descriptions of them, and we have a mix to start. And then we say, well, if we look at the feature fever, then it splits the data in a nice way in the sense that if you don't have a fever, it just covers negative examples, people that don't have COVID. If you do have a fever, well, it mostly covers patients that have COVID, but there are a few people who have a fever for some other reason. So this side is clearly not no COVID, but then here we have to split on another feature, so we pick maybe something like loss of smell, and then it decides, okay, if we split on that, then we've really gotten all COVID patients on the yes branch, and then we have all no COVID on the no branch. So this is a very simplistic, very simplified example of how you can build these sort of symbolic decision trees by just analyzing data and building them top down by picking good features at each node. And the trick is finding a good heuristic for picking that feature at each node. So again, just doing a really quick survey of each of these approaches, what are some of the weaknesses of this approach? So it assumes the problem is governed by a simple logical structure, and it doesn't really allow for any sort of uncertainty or randomness or probabilistic aspect to it. It's very binary, black and white. It has this feature, it's in this disease, it has this disease. And also there's lots of rules. There's lots of trees you could construct. There's a huge space, it's an exponential space when you mathematically analyze it. And it can be hard to find the right set of rules that fit the data, or the right tree to fit the data from that large amount of data. So there's a big computational issue of how to do that. And there are a lot of heuristic sort of approaches that have been done to solve this problem effectively. Okay, so that's the symbolic rule-based approach. The next approach is the Bayesian probabilistic approach. Here, we assume that the data that we want to classify was somehow generated by a structured random process that in the community is called a probabilistic generative model. And I'll give you an example in the spam filtering case in a minute. But then we use probability theory to compute the most likely decision or categorization, assuming that the data was generated using this model of how the data was generated. And this whole approach is typically called Bayesian because it's named after a very famous British mathematician, Bayes, who formulated this theorem that's instrumental in how this approach is utilized. And it says that the probability of some hypothesis given some evidence, that's like, what's the probability that someone has a disease given that they have symptoms? You can actually calculate that from a model of how likely the symptoms are given the disease, or how likely the evidence is given the disease, which is usually easier to estimate, and the prior probability, how likely is having that disease a priori. So a classic line from doctors is if you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. In other words, you want to assume the more likely a priori hypothesis, and that's where that P of hypothesis, the prior of that hypothesis comes in. And then if you just divide that by how likely is those set of symptoms, then you can actually indirectly calculate how likely each disease is given those symptoms using this simple formula that Reverend Bayes came up with in the late 1700s, I'm sorry. Okay, so that, again, I'm not getting into any mathematical details here, but here's what a generative model looks like. Say we're trying to do spam classification, a problem that Adam talked about last week. We build this very simplistic probabilistic model of how email is generated. We assume that email is generated by first picking from this urn, or this urn is meant to be a sort of a set of marbles. There's a classic metaphor that's used in probability theory is we have an urn filled with a bunch of marbles, but these marbles are labeled with words. And at the category level, we first pick out a marble to decide what category of email we're going to create. And say we pick out, we want to generate a spam document. So then you have two urns, an urn that I sample words if I want to generate a legitimate non-spam document, and one urn if I want to generate a spam document. So I picked spam from the category urn, so I come over here to the spam urn and I repeatedly sample words from the spam urn. There's words that tend to occur in spam. I know I generated this crazy example, Viagra hot deal, exclamation points. Found out early on, a good way to detect spam is that it uses lots of exclamation points. So this is the very simplistic model. We're assuming how email is generated. And we'll get to why this is obviously a crazy model, but it's actually quite useful. And then we get a new document in. Say we get win, lottery, $, exclamation point. And we want to know, is that spam or not? We ask the probabilistic question, is it more likely that I generated that string, that email, by picking spam from the spam urn and then picking words from the red urn? Or is it more likely that I picked not legit from the category urn and then picked words from the legit urn? I get these boring things. This is meant to be like computer science student email, computer test, homework, score, and I got a boring email because I picked words from the blue urn. And then using Bayes' theorem, we can easily calculate how likely each of those cases are and then pick the most likely scenario. Hopefully you would all agree that the most likely scenario here is it actually came by picking spam and then going to the red urn. So we would classify that as spam. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some intuition how, and this is called naive Bayes. I'm sorry I didn't introduce that term, because it's like the simplest Bayesian or probabilistic approach you can imagine to solving this problem. That's why people call it naive, but it actually works, it can actually work surprisingly well. But how do we learn these models? Well, you have to assume a basic structure of the model. Like, I understand that, oh, this is how email is generated with this very simplistic, naive model of having these terms of spam urn and the non-spam urn. And then we have to fit the data. We have to find the distribution in those urns by just looking at a bunch of data and estimating a set of parameters. In this case, we need to estimate, well, how likely is spam a priori? We just look at our whole pile of training email. We see what fraction of them are spam. That's the prior on how likely spam is, not knowing anything about the email. And then I estimate these conditional probabilities of how likely is each feature given the category. In this case, how likely is each word given the spam? How likely is, Viagra to appear in spam versus regular email? Or how likely is homework to appear in a normal document versus a spam document? And we estimate those features. We get the parameters on those probabilistic model, and we can use Bayes' theorem to calculate how likely each conclusion is. Okay, so hopefully that, again, gives you a little bit of an idea how the probabilistic approach works. Well, what are some of the weaknesses of this whole approach? Well, it assumes that we have this generative probabilistic model and that it's at least approximately correct. But of course, that crazy model of 2 urns of randomly sampling words is not a good model of how email is generated at all. But there's this great aphorism from a statistician named George Box. He said, all models are wrong. When you're doing this probabilistic model, we know that the probabilistic model is making totally unreasonable assumptions. It doesn't prevent them from being useful for solving problems. So when I teach class, I just constantly utter this phrase, every time model we introduce, well, George Box said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so even though the model is sort of whacked in its assumptions it's making, it can actually do the task relatively well because of this sort of aphorism that Box referred to. But for this to work, we not only have to have a good model, we need to estimate the parameters, but to estimate good parameters, we need a lot of data. So you need sufficient data to get good estimates on all the parameters that model needs. And the more complicated model you use, the more parameters there are, and the more data you need to estimate those parameters. Okay? So that's just a quick review of the probabilistic approach. Well, now we get to what's today the most common, most popular approach, which I'm calling the connectionist neural net approach. And it stems from this history of trying to computationally model the actual processing and learning in real neurobiological systems like the human brain. And I took this picture I actually did take a neurobiology class when I was an undergraduate 40 years ago. And this is the picture we had in our textbook of what a neuron looks like, right? It has a cell body. It has these little branches on it called dendrites. Then it has this long axon that conducts an electrical signal down to another set of dendrites that have little synapses on them. And that they release when the neuron undergoes an electrical pulse where there's an electrical difference between the inside and the outside of the cell. And then if that reaches the end of a synapse, it releases some chemicals that travel over to another neuron, which absorbs those synapses, those chemicals from the synapses, and then they integrate the information from all the neurons that are, quote, talking to it to make a decision about whether it should fire a pulse or not. So again, this is my really quick review of how real neurons work, that there's an electrical potential across the cell membrane, and that will exhibit this sort of spike behavior. At some point, suddenly there'll be a big bump in that electrical potential across the cell membrane. And then it travels down the cell body, hits an axon, causes the synaptic terminals to release neurotransmitters. Those chemicals diffuse across this little gap called a synapse to touch the dendrites of other neurons, And those neurotransmitters, the chemicals that get transmitted, can be of 2 types, excitatory or inhibitory. Excitatory means it tends to cause the cell that it connects to fire. Inhibitory means it tends to inhibit the cell that it's connected to. And if the net input of neurotransmitters is positive, in other words, there's more positive information, positive influence flowing into the cell more than negative, then it fires off its impulse, and then it communicates with its other cells, and then it propagates through all the whole network of all your billions of neurons in your brain. Okay, so that's neurobiology 101. So in real neural learning, in real brains, we do know that learning happens by synapses changing their size and their strength and how much chemicals they transmit and what type of chemicals they transmit as when they fire. And there's a learning rule that's known in neurobiology called Hebbian. It's named after this guy, Hebb. It says when two neurons that are connected together are firing together at the same time, it strengthens the synapse between them. So neurobiology students learn that you incorporate this with this phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. If two neurons are firing at the same time, they tend to increase their connection to each other so that they're more likely to fire together in the future. Now, that's real neurobiology. We'll get to some of the history here in a minute, but starting quite a long time ago, people started modeling these. Once we understood what a neuron was doing, people built a mathematical model of these neurons. So we model a network as a graph with cells where each node represents a neuron, and then there's a weight or an edge between those two neurons, which represents the strength of the connection between those two neurons. And that can be positive or negative, reflecting whether it's an inhibitory or an excitatory connection. And then we mathematically model, this is like my one real equation, I had the Bayes theorem, this is my second real equation in here, that the net input to a cell is the weighted sum. So we sum up across each of the neurons connecting to it, the weight of its connection times whether it's firing or not. The O is just 0 or 1, whether that neuron is firing or not. And if that sum, if I have more neurons, and the idea in this diagram is the red lines indicate excitatory connections, and the width of the line is how strong it is, and then the blue is meant to be negative. So you have different strengths and directions of connectivity, and if I sum all of that activity up, if it exceeds a threshold, then the neuron fires off. So that's what this so-called step function illustrates here, is if the net input exceeds some threshold, then it fires off a cell. Its activity becomes 1. So that's this very simple mathematical model of the neuron that was developed back in the 40s, I believe, actually, originally. Now, neural net learning actually started back in the 50s. And what's happened is, in the early days, in 1958, this algorithm called perceptron was developed by this guy named Frank Rosenblatt at Cornell, as I remember. It was a way to learn the weights on one neuron. So it was how to learn the simplest neural network you can imagine, one with basically one neuron, where you have a set of inputs. Like those might be, neurons in your eye that give fire off if there's a photon that hits them. And you have a set of inputs, like just pixels in an image. And then it goes into just one neuron that has to classify it with just this linear function. And this algorithm was developed to learn those very simple neural networks way back in 1958, except one neuron can only learn very, very limited restricted set of functions or set of possible computations I might make. So then the symbolic paradigm actually took over in the 60s and the 70s, and then in the 80s, because they said, these perceptrons are too simple, they can't work. But then in the 80s, people started saying, well, we can extend these ideas to multi-layer networks. The big networks that were studied in the 80s were so-called 3-layer networks. Whoa, we're working up to the 3 layers where we have inputs, the so-called hidden layer, which we never get to see, so inside the brain, and then the output, which is some decision, like spam or not spam, or this is a cat or this is a dog. And then when you're classifying an example, say you put an image in at the input, it propagates forward activity using the neural computation to the output, and then it decides, this is a cat or a dog or a mouse or an image of something else. That's what I'm calling the activation going forward. Then you train this model by this approach called back propagation, where you say, was the output right? Was this really an image of a cat? If it's not, then you back propagate an error signal that goes back through the networks, and as it goes back, you calculate a particular formula that adjusts those weights at each layer as it goes back from the output back to the input through the hidden layer, and adjust those weights in just a little way to help get that example right. And that's called the back propagation algorithm. Now, neural nets, the Bayesian approach actually took over in machine learning in the 90s and the early 2000s. And then I would say starting about 2010, people said, well, let's really try to train really deep neural networks with hundreds of intermediate layers. And a lot of this was possible because a lot of data was available and there was a lot of compute available. I was just talking to Don about GPUs, graphics processing units, that really allowed you to train these deep networks effectively by adjusting literally billions of these weights in a very deep network with hundreds or even thousands of layers in them. And slowly techniques for doing that and having the data and the compute to actually do that developed throughout the 2010s and through, up to the current day. And that's why things are called deep learning, because they're training these neural networks that we can now train are hundreds of layers deep, rather than just starting with the one layer that we were able to train in the 50s. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of background on how neural nets work. How does the learning algorithm actually do this? Well, the algorithm is this general approach called gradient descent, which is not really guaranteed to work, but it just sort of tweaks things, trying to make it better at every step. So computer scientists, we love pseudocode, so I had to give you at least some pseudocode here. It says, initially, you don't know what the right weights on these connections between the neurons are, so we just set them randomly. Then we loop through, we look at each of our outputs, we show it an image, and we say, that's a cat. We show it an image, that's a dog. We show it an image, that's another cat. We show it an image, that's a parrot, or whatever. We do the forward propagation to compute the output for that network. What does it say it is? Does it say the cat is a cat, or does it actually say the cat is a dog? And if it's wrong, we back propagate this error back to the input, and at each point, we tweak the weights in a little way that helps it get that example right. And every time we just tweak the weights a little bit, pushing them in the right direction. And then we repeat this for all the examples in our training set. Then we repeat that again. It's called an epic. And we go back and we go through the examples again. It's like having flashcards, and you go through the flashcards once, and then you train the network. And then you go through the flashcards again. You keep going through flashcards, training the network until it finally does very well on all the examples that are in your training set. It gets all those flashcards right, basically. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea of how gradient descent and training these algorithms work. Okay, so to move on to the weaknesses of this approach, well, I've told you this backpropagation algorithm, it has no biological reality at all. Hebbian learning actually happens in neural networks, real neural networks in brains. Backpropagation does not. So these mechanisms do not model real biology at all. Sometimes I feel like that's a misconception. People think they do, they don't. It requires very large amounts of data and compute resources to adjust all these net weights in these huge networks from large amounts of training data. It takes a lot of compute resources and a lot of data to effectively train these deep networks with just these billions of parameters. Another criticism that people usually leverage at this approach is once you learn it, it's learning this very complicated thing with all these incredible number of parameters, and it says, okay, this person has COVID, and it's like, should I believe it or not? It doesn't really do well at explaining its decisions, because its decision is based on such a complicated computational process. It's not intuitive unlike decision trees or rules, which are relatively intuitive to explain to a person why the decision was made. This thing is just this really complicated computation that's done over, millions of neurons, and it's just impossible to understand what it's doing. Okay. So the next approach here I put is the evolutionary approach in genetic algorithms, where we search for a learned concept using a method analogous to biological evolution. And you can actually apply this to different ways of representing concepts. It's been applied to rules, to trees, to neural networks. So it's a way to do the second problem. You can represent your concept however you want, but you can search the space of hypotheses to find a good one, to find a good concept by using simulated evolution. And the key idea it uses from biological evolution is this concept of crossover, where you somehow represent the concept in a string, or you can even do this with trees, and then you take two good hypotheses as parents, and you generate a new hypothesis by crossing over and flipping pieces of it, so the children get part of one parent's solution and another part of the other parent's solution. And you get two new potential solutions by doing that crossover. And then you test, well, are those hypotheses better or worse? And then you do survival of the fittest, right? The ones that do well and fit the data you keep, and they stay in the population to reproduce and make other hypotheses. And if not, they die because they didn't fit the data. And then you simulate evolution. Again, this can take quite a while of iterating through these steps of reproduction and filtering using fitness in order to eventually find a good concept. So what are some of the limitations of this approach? Well, natural selection is a slow process, and more directed approaches to finding concepts frequently do better than this sort of evolutionarily modeled approach. Okay, so I knew I put a lot in here. I'm going to have to try to, unfortunately, sorry for going so quickly through all these different things. But the last approach I want to talk about is analogical or instance-based, where you avoid learning any abstract concept at all, but instead reason from individual cases. And the simple approach to this is called nearest neighbor, where during training, all you do is remember the training data. You don't do anything. You don't build any hypothesis. But you might want to index them efficiently so you can find similar examples. But you get a test case in, and you say, well, what's the most similar example to what I've seen during training? You find the most similar example. To do this efficiently, you need to build some sort of indexing structure. But then you assign it the category of the most similar instance you've seen during training. So it looks something like this. I have a bunch of points here, say red is spam or COVID, and then blue is not COVID or not spam. And then we get this black point there, if you can see it in the middle. I say, well, what's the closest point to it? And I say, oh, it's this red point. OK, so I'm going to call it red. Now, you might look at this and say, I'm not so sure I would have called that point red, given where it is in this space. And so there's a generalization of this approach called k-nearest neighbor, where the normal nearest neighbor is subject to misclassifying an example due to just one single example. Sort of a lot to base a decision on. It's just one example. It might be incorrectly labeled. It might be an outlier that's not really representative of the class. So k-nearest neighbor says, oh, we can improve that by taking a majority vote amongst the k closest examples. So here now I take that black point. I say, what are the three? So there's concept is a hyperparameter. You can set it 3, 5. It's good to have odds so you don't get ties. And you say, what are the three closest examples? Oh, well, now I get to pick up one red point and two blue points. So I vote, and it says, oh, that's blue. Which you might think, looking at this, is a little more reasonable, because it seems a little more in the blue territory than it is in the red territory. That's called k-nearest neighbor. OK, so what's the weaknesses of this approach? Well, who decides what's similar? There's lots of different ways of measuring similarity of examples. There's a lot of work on what are good measures of doing that. And it requires effective indexing, so you don't have to search through all the training data. You don't want to, if you have, Google has billions of emails that have been labeled spam or not. You don't want to have to go through every one of them. Oh, is this close? Is this close? Is this close? You want to index those so you can get those nearest neighbors very efficiently. And that's an interesting algorithmic problem in computer science. OK, so I have 4 minutes left. Sorry, we're rushing through a lot of material here, but I was given the task of trying to explain various paradigms. So that's sort of one dimension of how to separate machine learning, which is the type of approach of how concepts are represented and how I find hypotheses. Another approach is, what is the type of supervision that comes in? And what Adam and I have all been talking about is supervised learning, right? But that's just one approach to machine learning. A whole other approach is called unsupervised learning, where I learn when I don't have the labels on the data. I just get the data points, and I don't put a color on them. It's all black points. There's no colors on them. There's no labels that are defined. And I do this test of clustering, where I want to group them into coherent sets. And so here I have a set of points. I haven't colored them at all, but I want you to put 3 colors on them. How would you do that? Well, here I have to pick the number of clusters I think there are, which is a difficult problem in its own right. But let's say I even tell you there are 3 clusters here. Presumably, you look at this as a human, you say, it's pretty clear, right? There's this group of red points up here. There's this group of blue points at the bottom. And then on the upper right, there's a group of green points. How can we get an algorithm that can recognize that sort of structure in the data and automatically group points into categories, not giving any training supervision of what color they really belong to? And then the final type of machine learning I want to briefly talk about that someone else will have or will talk later more about is reinforcement learning, where it's somewhere between unsupervised and supervised. Sometimes people call it like weak supervision, where you learn to perform a task that requires performing multiple actions in order to eventually get to a goal. But the only supervision you get is after you make a lot of decisions. You don't get feedback every time you make an action, whether it's good or bad. You have to wait till you do a bunch of actions. And then you're doing an exam. You have to do the whole exam, and then you eventually get your grade back. You're not getting feedback after every case. So it's much harder to learn from that sort of so-called delayed reward or delayed reinforcement. And there's a whole area of machine learning that looks at algorithms for doing this, where you try to learn a policy that decides what actions to take at each step that maximize the long-term reward, but not knowing after every action what's good and what's bad. And then this is sort of the general picture that people in reinforcement learning, usually abbreviated RL, will show you, where you have the environment, like the classic example is like a rat running in a maze, right? At any point, the rat can turn left or right or go forward or backward, and it wants to go through a sequence of actions, but it doesn't get rewarded until it gets to the end and gets its cheese, right? So but you have to just explore this environment, figure out where you eventually get the cheese, and then learn, how did I get there? And there's a whole body of reinforcement learning techniques that do that. And of course, there's one of the biggest successes recently in deep learning was when people use this RL approach, combining it with deep learning, where you learn a neural network to pick moves with a very large neural net trained on tons of data, and it won the Go championship. This is the winning game against Lee Sedol, and the computer became the world's champion at Go using these reinforcement learning techniques. Okay, so I'm sorry I had to rush through a lot there, but I was trying to cover a lot of intellectual territory. But hopefully I've given you a flavor of the 5 tribes of different types of machine learning and then the different types of supervision, supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning. Okay, we can go to the quiz now.
So we have a few questions, and I think we have one from the audience. So why don't we start with the question from the audience here?
I have two questions particular to neural networks. So you mentioned the concept of gradient descent. So I was wondering if the tuning of the weights of each edge across epochs, is that a form of reinforcement learning for the neural network?
So you can train the network either using direct supervision, supervised learning, or you can indirectly get supervision by running a reinforcement learning algorithm. But at the end of the day, you are getting some output saying, I want the output to be this. Sometimes it's given directly by the teacher. Sometimes it's some intermediate calculation that's done by the reinforcement learner. So you can train neural nets with either reinforcement learning with weak supervision, which means you're going to need more data. Again, there's no free lunch, right? There actually is a theorem in machine learning called NFL. It doesn't stand for the National Football League. It stands for no free lunch, which says that, you only learn something if it's in the data and in supervision. So you can train you using backpropagation both for deep RL and for supervised learning. Is just the type of, you're going to need a lot more. One standard thing with reinforcement learning is it takes a lot of data because the supervision you're getting for each example is very weak. So you need more data, you get even noisier feedback, and you're going to need more data to go through backpropagation and train up a good network.
And then my second question was about, you mentioned that the neural networks are very kind of black box and they're not very explainable. But would saliency maps be something that help with the AI explainability?
Yeah, so there's a whole area called XAI, which stands for Explainable AI. I was actually on a DARPA-funded project for 3 years, specifically looking at this issue, where you try to take deep networks and crack them open and try to understand more what they're doing. And there's a lot of different approaches for this. You can find, well, what are the, say you're doing image classification. You can analyze the network and say, what part of the image were you really focused on? What part of the image had the most impact on the decision that the neural network made? And say you're trying to judge whether a person is happy or sad. And you see that it hones in on their mouth or something like that. And it looks at the shape of the mouth to figure out, and you're like, I see. So there's lots of ways to sort of pry open the black box and get information. Another thing you can do is actually try to analyze that hidden layer. What has that hidden layer actually learned? So a classic example that I remember from way back when I was in grad school in the 80s, when there was this network called NetTalk that learned to produce speech by looking at text. So you would give it text and you would say how to pronounce that actually. So it's like learning to read in a sense of converting text to speech. And they looked open, cracked open the hidden layer. And they said, well, when is this one neuron? When does it tend to fire? When does it tend to be active? And it found out, well, if the letter you're trying to pronounce is a consonant versus a vowel, it would light up if you're trying to pronounce a consonant and stay blank if you're trying to pronounce a vowel. So you can actually argue that it learned the distinction between consonant and vowels, and that's a fundamental distinction that determines how to pronounce a letter, is whether it's a consonant or a vowel. And the system automatically learned this, and you can actually crack into the hidden layer and find neurons that you can interpret. But then a lot of other neurons you have, like, what the heck is this one doing? I don't know. But you can dig in, and there are lots of ways of trying to dig into networks, figure out what they're doing, find out, oh, this neuron is detecting this interesting distinction. Oh, when it's classifying this example, it's looking at this part of this set of features and this part of the image or this part of the text to classify whether it's spam. It'll look, oh, what are the words that it's really highlighting when it's deciding that this is spam? And if it highlights, exclamation point, you say, that makes sense. It's really looking at the exclamation point to understand whether this is spam or not. So yeah, but there's a whole area called XAI that studies this.
So here's an early one from the lecture, and one that Zifan's already addressed a little bit, but I'll ask you again. It seems like the neural net approach is a more complex version of the Bayesian approach.
There's a whole area. Each one of these areas, actually, one time when I taught my class, I put up maybe these 5 areas or others. There's cross products. So there's an area called deep Bayesian networks or deep belief networks. So so the complexity is independent. You can build a Bayesian network that's as complex as a deep network. It's just the calculations that you do on that network. And so doing deep belief nets is even more complicated to train and do the inference than deep neural nets. But the complexity of the network is a separate, independent issue. I just think, and deep belief nets and deep probabilistic networks are a growing area of research. One of our own faculty, Chang Liu, right, works specifically in this area, and he would be a better person I guess he's not talking in here, but he would be a better person to answer this question. But it's just doing Bayesian on complicated networks is harder than doing neural nets on big networks. But in principle, they can both process deep networks.
Okay. Is current research trying to address how to determine the features and rules by which successful neural nets categorize data?
Can you read that?
Is current research trying to address how to determine the features, rules by which successful
so part of this is part of the XAI answer, where you can analyze and see, but there is this also area where you try to take a neural net and translate it into a set of rules. So one of my best friend, who's a former faculty member at University of Wisconsin-Madison, did some of this work in the early 90s, where you take a network and you try to analyze and actually extract, it's usually called rule extraction from neural networks, where you can actually extract symbolic rules from the network to try to understand and interpret what it's doing. Now, a lot of times the neural net will translate into just a pile of extremely complicated rules. But in principle, you can always translate a neural net into a set of rules. It's just those rules might end up being very complicated. But there is work on just analyzing networks and trying to extract rules from them. So like I said, this whole area of explainable AI, interpretability, there's lots of ways of trying to dig into networks and figure out what, then sort of crack open the black box and figure out what they are doing. But there is a way to actually translate a neural net into a set of more interpretable rules.
It seems like the line between methods can be kind of blurry, or like they can be implemented together at times. Is there any interest in creating the sort of Sauron algorithm suggested by the book title that self-determines what sort of methods to use? Or do people apply specific techniques for specific problems?
That is an excellent question, and the answer is not surprisingly yes. In fact, that is one of Pedro's points in the book, that you really want the master algorithm to incorporate aspects of all these different approaches, or maybe call on different approaches at different points in time. And and that point of his I actually do agree on. But like I said, there are crossover areas. We talked about deep Bayesian networks, which sort of crosses over neural nets with Bayesian learning. There's things that any two of those, you could pick them. So another one of our faculty members, Risto Mikalainen, works at the intersection between neural nets and genetic algorithms. People have looked at that. People have looked at the intersection between instance-based and rules. So every one of these techniques have been tried to combine or hybridize with one of the other ones. And there are lots of approaches in the middle. One thing I wanted to bring up is a popular area these days is neurosymbolic, where you actually try to combine some of the advantages of the symbolic approach with the neural approach. And I personally, because I come from a more symbolic background originally, but I've gotten into neural nets, we're researching literally all of these paradigms at one point in time. But I think there's a lot of things to be gained there by saying, how can we combine, symbolic methods with neural methods in interesting ways? And there's one idea I like, there's the idea of neuromodular networks, where you have the neural networks are broken down into interpretable modules that you can understand. And then you combine like with Lego. Actually, there's a new technique called Lego NN or something, where you try to build pieces of neural networks that solve one task, and then modularly build those pieces of neural networks into a larger neural network that has more interpretable structure to it. So neurosymbolic is a large particular area right now, trying to combine some of the ideas from symbolic paradigm with neural networks.
Well, given just what you've just said, I'll ask this just as a follow-up to that. So you've talked about 5 methods, and you've talked about a lot of other refinements of that. Are any of these methods currently considered obsolete, or are they all subjects of ongoing research?
Yeah, so I would say they're all subjects of ongoing research. I mean, at any given time, different paradigms. Like I said, I've actually told you the history a little bit. In the very early days, neural nets were dominant. Then symbolic came in. Then neural nets came back. Then Bayesian took over. Now we're back with neural nets. There's a whole other approach sort of in between neural nets and instance-based called support vector machines and kernel methods that were popular for a while. And my position is definitely that all of these paradigms have their strengths and weaknesses. That's why I tried to put a weakness slide after every approach, saying they all have their weaknesses. And we might synthesize them, but I still think there is room to continue research along all of these threads, and that they're all still worthy contenders, in building, as Pedro calls it, I like the term the master algorithm.
You've mentioned that some of the recent deep network research has had results that depended a lot on the scale of the data and the computation that is now possible to do. Can you give us some idea of what kind of scale you're talking about here?
Yes, I mean, if you take, again, I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but like I said, these networks contain billions of, literally billions of parameters. And you know, we don't even know what data like ChatGPT was trained on. They have basically scraped everything out on the web. I don't know if we can you have an idea of how many gigabytes of text there is all over the web? I don't know.
Gigabytes, you're using
petabyte,
the wrong,
petabytes.
There you go.
For what is that even? 10 to, we don't know the scientific notation. Yeah, it's huge. So, and you know, like we were talking about, and I was talking to Don about before, is we couldn't process all this data. So I was telling Don, you know, in the break that I really think the success of deep learning is mainly due to data. We have lots more data, both unsupervised, which we can just scrape off the web, tons of text, tons of images, and you can do what's called self-supervised. Like language models, you just try to predict the next word. So you don't need human supervision to do it. You just scrape the text and you say, okay, try to predict the next word. Supervised training to predict the next word. It's called self-supervision. But then also, I might get supervision. So there's this really famous data set built at Stanford called ImageNet, where how did they get labels on all sorts of images? This is a dog, this is a cat, this is a laptop, this is a pen, you know, is they had humans do crowdsourcing. So another big entry in all of this of getting data was massive crowdsourcing using tools like Amazon Mechanical Turk to get supervision at a much higher scale. And all the success in learning over the past decade or more has to do with exploiting all the data that's out there on the internet and exploiting crowdsourcing to add, you know, more direct supervision to that data. And then once we have all that data, how do we train a network? The billions of parameters on billions of data points is we need extreme compute. We need huge server farms with tons of GPUs to train this. And so now, OpenAI won't even tell you how much data they're using, how many parameters their model has, or how much compute time they put into building these things. And another thing that comes up here is the carbon footprint of training these huge models. That running all these computers to train these huge models has a huge carbon footprint. So there's a whole area that's sort of arisen, usually called like green AI or green ML, where you try to build algorithms that are more energy efficient.
So it seems like in that situation, supervision and the human factor in that is quite the bottleneck, and I guess that's something that's important now to try to address.
Right, well, so like I said, crowdsourcing is addressed to a certain amount, but the way like NLP systems are built this day is you do what's first called pre-training. And I'm sure Greg, when he talks about NLP, will talk more about this later. But you first train a method to do one thing where you have supervision for. So say for language, I try to predict the next word, or I blank out a word in the middle of the text and I try to predict it. And I don't need human supervision for that. I just download the data. Images, I can just block out a part of the image and say predict, that's called inpainting, predict what's in this part of the image. And train a model to predict missing pieces of the input. That's called self-supervision. Now you build a model that does that. That's called pre-training. Now you have a task you really want to do, like spam versus not spam. Now you need relatively few examples of a human labeling spam versus not spam. But you start with the network pre-trained on this prediction task. You can now so-called fine-tune it with relatively small amounts of human supervision to do well on a specific task, say spam filtering, using much less data than you would need if you just start a spam training from scratch. By you pre-train on just random supervision, self-supervision by predicting parts of images and parts of text, and then you fine-tune on a small amount of human label data, usually collected using crowdsourcing, to fine-tune it to the specific task you want to solve. And that paradigm has been incredibly successful.
Okay, well, we have other questions, and as usual, we'll try to address those online later, but I think we're out of time now, and so let me just end by thanking Ray and letting you know that for the next 3 weeks, we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into some of the main areas recently in the news of progress in AI, those being vision, natural language processing, and robotics. And so next week in particular, we'll have Professor Kristen Grauman from the Computer Science Department, who is a world-class expert in vision, coming and talking to us about vision, and then we'll go into the other topics in the next few weeks. So thank you very much.